Hi, everybody. How are you tonight? It's great to see everyone. Thank you for being here at the museum. My name is Chris Molinsky. I'm the Janet L. Nolan Director of Curatorial and Educational Affairs at the museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight for our conversation with the artist Rodell Warner. Rodell Warner is a Trinidadian artist working primarily in new media and photography. And if you haven't seen his exhibition in the Audubon galleries, you'll have time after the talk tonight. As Rodell will discuss in more depth, his work is rooted in the exploration of race, nature, and technologies of representation. His work has been exhibited at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Taipei, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, the Museum of the Moving Image in New York, and at Big Medium in Austin, Texas, where he received the 2024 Titos Prize. We're really thrilled that this exhibition at the Jule is Rodell's first solo museum exhibition, and it's part of a large series that's been ongoing at the museum for the past couple of years called Radical Naturalism. This series involves a conversation with the artist John James Audubon and our Audubon collection, and work by contemporary artists like Rodell that we invite to Auburn to be in conversation with our Audubon collection. And Rodell will explain his work related to this particular commission tonight. I extend my deepest appreciation to the entire museum staff for the important work surrounding this program. I'm also grateful for our museum donors for their investments to present these and other programs, and to our unit leadership, President Christopher B. Roberts. Following Rodell's talk, we'll have a conversation on the stage here, and we'll pass around a microphone for questions. So just be thinking of any questions you'd like to ask Rodell as we go on. Now, please join me in welcoming the artist Rodell Warner.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's been really good to be here today. Just been here one day and just had some really valuable conversations with students and staff here. So really appreciate everybody coming, and I want to say thanks to Chris for inviting me to make this exhibition. I really enjoyed the process and working with everybody here, and I'm going to try to tell you kind of about some of the work that I do and kind of lead up to how it kind of manifested in this work that we're looking at in this exhibition. Okay, so I'm gonna, so this work in the exhibition draws on an archive. The Jule has this amazing collection of Audubon prints, and I want to tell you about how I kind of started working with archival material. So what you're looking at right now is a Tumblr blog that I started in like around 2009. Before I started being interested in archival images from Trinidad, which is what this is, these are all archival images from Trinidad that I found online and kind of started cataloging on this Tumblr, which is called Too Much Eyes, toomucheyes.tumblr.com. And before I got into this, I did not care about much of Trinidad's history. I played in a rock band, and my friends and I were very much outward looking. We did not care very much about the history of the place that we were from. And we had a kind of disdain for it. When I started working at an ad agency, that was a very inspiring place to work, with a studio full of artists who were older than me, um, about 20 years older than me, a few of them. When they noticed how much I didn't know about the place I was from, and how much I was missing out, as they saw it, um, they tried to teach me about it. So, they would talk about when they were younger, and there were like trade protections that meant that local designers had shops that did really well. Um, and that local carnival costume designers were really inventive and made really amazing exhibitions, basically for carnival. And that I was, in a kind of poverty for not being aware of this. I started looking online to see what they were talking about. I started collecting pictures. I would just Google Trinidad 1945, Trinidad shoe 1927, and just like fish online for pictures. And whatever I found, I would kind of collect it on this website. And it sort of connected me also to other people who care about the history of Trinidad, including um, people who don't live in Trinidad, but who's like first generation American or Canadian. Um, and this is how I started, like how I got into archiving. Also, at home, I had at the time like dial-up internet and like 50 hours a month, which was very limiting. But at work, at the studio, I could be online all the time. So I spent a lot of time in 2008, 2009, just trying to get a sense of what this place that these older people were talking about was, and to understand how I kind of fit into it. Um, yeah, and that just kind of led to, create a chain reaction of um, making a bunch of different types of things, and I'm going to try and tell you about it. Um, okay, so now I want to tell you about exploring connections to other archives that I encountered online, and discovering a desire to seek out historical images of Black people that have escaped an oppressive framing. Um, so, looking for images online kind of got me into not just looking for images of Trinidad, but just diving into archives in general. Um, there's a UK National Archive that I would look in, really amazing high-res images. A lot of them related to the Caribbean, but a lot of them not related to the Caribbean. The New York Public Library Archive, also amazing high-res images. And I would do the same kind of fishing. Like I would just use search terms, sometimes use dates, and just see what I could find. And after searching and finding like just a bunch of random things, I started to wonder how I relate to these things, and started trying to understand like which images felt like they were valuable to me and more valuable to me than others. And what I sort of realized I was interested in was, well, if you look for pictures of Black people on most of these archives, you're going to find many of them, but they're going to have been framed by slavery. They're going to have found some kind of oppressive framing. That's how those images of those people ended up in those archives. But every now and then you find one that is for some other reason, like this portrait of the boxer Richmond, which is painted by Robert Dighton. And when I would find images like this, I would try to, these things are in archives. They're buried online. Nobody's really looking at these things. I've gone fishing and found it, and I want to talk to people about it. I think of an artwork as an object that you put into public space, and people who want to have a conversation about that object, they're drawn to it. People who don't want to talk about that thing, they go the other way. But the ones who are drawn by the object, they encounter each other and they encounter each other's ideas, and they have conversations about those objects. And so when I make an artwork, and when I think about what the point of making an artwork is, this is something that I think about often. This idea of like creating conversation, putting something in public space that like generates a conversation. And that could be valuable for many reasons. It could be that I've noticed something that I think is valuable. And I also was talking this morning with one of the classes here about how an artwork can function in that way. I was better at that time because I made notes, but let me try and paraphrase. So we were talking about art and how it relates to place. And what I was saying is that an artwork, well, a place, the specificity of a place has a lot to do with determining the lives, the culture of the people who live in that place. So culture, I have a friend, one of those mentors from that studio, one of those artist that's 20 years older than me that taught me a lot of things. His name's Dave Williams. He's a choreographer and a writer from Trinidad. And Dave's definition of culture is the set of solutions that given people have found for living in a particular place. So if there is a particular food or fruit or a vegetable that grows abundantly in a particular country, when the people who live there solve the problem of hunger by finding all kinds of ways to prepare dishes using that food, candying it or currying it or dehydrating it or learning that they should stay away from it, that set of solutions that forms their culture. And so the specificity of a place does a lot to determine how people live in that place. And so if you make an artwork about a place, or if you make an artwork about the specificity of a place or a people, then that artwork has the ability to affect the culture of those people. What I think I'm interested in with this type of work is in pushing against the overwhelming avalanche of oppressive images that we find in archives and that inform our imaginations about who the Black people of the past were. And so I celebrate images like this and I want to put them in public space so that people can have conversations about them and so that they can expand our range of references, the things that we think about when we think about the people from the past. This is another example of an image that I found in an archive that I made an artwork of that I brought out of that hidden space to bring into public space. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about at the same time that I'm discovering. I also want to say that a lot of what I value about being here today is the conversation that I'm having with y'all. So I'm interested in what you are thinking about these things, and there's going to be time for us to talk about these things afterwards. So please keep your questions in mind or note them. So at the same time that I'm developing an interest in archives and thinking about how archival material, like what kind of place it has in my life and why it's valuable to share it, I'm like at the same time developing an interest in digital abstraction and in otherness, just in the sort of possibilities of creating new types of images and sort of escaping from even subtle oppressive framings. Like I was very much into photography around the time I was discovering those archival images. And after a while, even my mentors had very strong ideas about the types of things that I should be photographing. But my friends online, the sort of weirdos I was meeting online who were doing all kinds of crazy things digitally, they were not bound by sort of strict ideas about how photography should function. And so I was kind of drawn towards what they were doing and inspired by what they were doing. And so like I kind of moved away from photography in a kind of documentary way and became more interested in abstraction and the types of possibilities for images that we could create with the same intention to like expand imagination and expand what we think about when we think about ourselves, and when we think about Black people. And for a long time, I was kind of even resistant to that type of definition. I still feel resistance now, but that's absolutely what I'm doing. It's absolutely what I'm interested in, as uncomfortable as it is sometimes. These are some other works. These are family photos that are of my own family. These were shot by my cousin Gerald, I think around 1995. My mom is the woman in the black t-shirt in the front. My cousin is wearing a green t-shirt in the center. These are other cousins and friends. And yeah, I appreciate this image for the same reason, for the type of imagination that it conjures or that it inspires or suggests or prompts. This is another image from that series. That's me on the left, my brother in the center, and my cousin on the right. Yeah, this is just part of that exploration of like what kind of abstraction, what digital abstraction can kind of do to images, how it might expand what we are able to imagine, and broadening references. Okay, so I made this video to show you how show you the process for how I create the videos that we see in the Audubon exhibition. It's very much a photo shoot that's set up in which a lens, which is that circular object in the center, is set up between a camera, which is that highlighted orange object, not this one, that's a light, but the sort of triangular object on the left is a camera, and then the image is a square object on the right. And yeah, this is the way that these objects are animated to create the illusions, the refractions and reflections that we see in the videos. This is what the final image looks like. And the image that we're looking at is a computational image. It's generated by a machine learning text-to-image model. It's an AI-generated image. And the intention is the same, to generate images, to create pictures that push against a lot of what we find in archives. So this is intended to look like a picture from the Caribbean, like a daguerreotype from the Caribbean from around like the 1850s or the late 1800s or the early 1900s, when the first pictures of Caribbean people were made. In the actual archive, in the existing photographic archive, the actual earliest pictures that we have of those people, they are almost never framed in any kind of personal or intimate context. They're almost always working. They're photographed sort of as the machinery of a colonial project. They're photographed, on a plantation with tools. And so as a result, when we think of the Caribbean people of the past, we think of laborers, and those images are post-slavery, but the aesthetics of those images are so close to the images of slaves that they read as slaves. And so there's a huge deficiency in that archive, but at the same time, it informs, and it's kind of the only information that we have about the people, visual information about those people. So this project is kind of intended to broaden our imagination about what those people's lives were like, to kind of think about like what those pictures might have looked like if those people had access to photography, which was expensive. And all the tools were imported, all the chemicals were imported. It would have been like many decades before we started seeing pictures that people took of themselves, people of African descent and Asian descent in the Caribbean. So yeah, this is an intention here to push back against what exists in the archive. A sort of conversation that came out of this work when I shared it. There were a couple of comments from friends of mine that I had to pay attention to about these works sort of endangering the archive, endangering the precious archive, endangering the actual images that we have of people from those periods. And I had to think about that seriously. And kind of where I ended up with that conversation, where I landed personally on it, is it came down to the question of whether we would want to defend and protect that version of our imagination of those people, even though it's so deficient and so harmful, or do we want to risk not knowing what is real and not real, but broaden the range of prompts or things we imagine when we think about those people? So these are the works that Chris Smolinski saw that I think spurred him to invite me to make the work for this exhibition. And so I just included this to share with you sort of another example of exploring archives and seeing what's possible with them. One of the things I wanted to do was to read some of the text from Audubon's journals. The way that this is all connected to Audubon is, I think, that his journals, what we find in them, are basically so many images of Black people, African Americans and Native Americans that are framed oppressively. But also, there are images of those people that are more complex. And so, in one of the conversations today, I was talking with Catherine, who I just met, one of the professors here, and she was saying, we were talking about truth and how the works that are in the exhibition, which overlay the text from Audubon's journals onto images of his illustrations, how they bring more truth to the conversation about him because of the way that they pack information into a moment. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do with this moment was to read some of the text from his work that do the same thing, bring more truth to the moment. And in this case, I think like just kind of speaks to the kind of complexity of the world that he and the people that he worked with existed in. So I'll read this. It won't take long. It's called The Runaway. It's one of the stories from volume 2 of his journal. So it's The Runaway. Never shall I forget the impression made on my mind by the encounter which forms the subject of this article, and I even doubt if the relation of it will not excite in that of my reader emotions of varied character. Late in the afternoon of one of those sultry days which render the atmosphere of the Louisiana swamps pregnant with baneful effluvia, I directed my course towards my distant home, laden with a pack consisting of 5 or 6 wood ibises and a heavy gun, the weight of which, even in those days when my natural powers were unimpaired, prevented me from moving with much speed. Reaching the banks of a miry bayou, only a few yards in breadth, but of which I could not ascertain the depth on account of the muddiness of its waters, I thought it might be dangerous to wade through it with my burden, for which reason, throwing to the opposite side each of my heavy birds in succession, together with my gun, powder flask, and shot bag, and drawing my hunting knife from its scabbard to defend myself, if need should be, against alligators, I entered the water, followed by my faithful dog. As I advanced carefully and slowly, Plato swam around me, enjoying the refreshing influence of the liquid element that cooled his fatigued and heated frame. The water dampened, as did the mire of its bed, but with a stroke or two I gained the shore. Scarcely had I stood erect on the opposite bank when my dog ran to me, exhibiting marks of terror, his eyes screaming ready to burst from their sockets, and his mouth grinning with the expression of hatred, while his feelings found vent in a stifled growl. Thinking that all this was produced by the scent of a wolf or bear, I stooped to take up my gun when a stentorian voice commanded me to stand still or die. Such a qui vive in these woods was as unexpected as it was rare. I instantly raised and cocked my gun, and although I did not yet perceive the individual who had thus issued so peremptory a mandate, I felt determined to combat with him for the free passage of the grounds. Presently, a tall, firmly built Negro emerged from the bushy underwood, where until that moment he must have been crouched, and in a louder voice repeated his injunction. Had I pressed a trigger, his life would have instantly terminated. But observing that the gun which he aimed at my breast was a wretched, rusty piece from which fire could not readily be produced, I felt little fear, and therefore did not judge it necessary to proceed at once to extremities. I laid my gun at his side, tapped my dog quietly, and asked the man what he wanted. My forbearance and the stranger's long habit of submission produced the most powerful effect on his mind. Master, he said, I am a runaway, and I might perhaps shoot you down, but God forbids it. For I feel just now as if I saw him ready to pass his judgment against me, for which a foul deed, and I ask mercy, for such a foul deed, and I ask mercy at your hands. For God's sake, do not kill me, master. And why? Answered I. Have you felt your quarters, where certainly you must have fared better than in these unwholesome swamps? Master, my story is short, but a sorrowful one. My camp is close by, and as I know you cannot reach home this night, if you will follow me there, depend upon my honor, you shall be safe until the morning, when I will carry your birds, if you choose, to the great road. The large, intelligent eyes of the Negro, the complacency of his manners, and the tones of his voice, I thought, invited me to venture, and as I felt that I was at least his equal, while, moreover, I had my dog to second me, I answered that I would follow him. He observed the emphasis laid on the words, the meaning of which he seemed to understand so thoroughly that, turning to me, he said, There, master, take my butcher's knife, while I throw away the flint and priming for my gun. Reader, I felt confounded. This was too much for me. I refused the knife and told him to keep his piece ready in case we might accidentally meet a cougar or a bear. Generosity exists everywhere. The greatest monarch acknowledges its impulse, and all around him, from the lowliest menial to the proud nobles that enrich, encircle, his throne, at times experience that overpowering sentiment. I offered to shake hands with the runaway. Master, he said, I beg your thanks. And with this, he gave me a squeeze that alike impressed me with the goodness of his heart and the great physical strength. From that moment, we proceeded together through the woods. My dog smelt at him several times, but as he heard me speak in my usual tone of voice, he soon left us and rambled around as long as my whistle was unused. As we proceeded, I observed that he was guiding me towards the setting of the sun, and quite contrary to my homeward course. I remarked this to him, when he, with the greatest simplicity, replied, merely for our security. After trudging along for some distance and crossing several bayous, at all of which he threw his gun and knife to the opposite bank and stood still until I had got over, we came to the borders of an immense canebrake from which I had, on former occasions, driven and killed several deer. We entered, and as I had frequently done before, now erect, then on all fours, we entered, as I had frequently done before, now erect, then on all fours. He regularly led the way, divided here and there the tangled stalks, and whenever we reached a fallen tree, assisted me in getting over it with all possible care. I saw that he was a perfect Indian in his knowledge of the woods, for he kept a direct course as precisely as any redskin I had ever traveled with. All of a sudden, he emitted a loud shriek, not unlike that of an owl, which so surprised me that I once more instantly leveled my gun. No harm, master. I only give notice to my wife and children that I am coming. A tremulous answer of the same nature gently echoed through the treetops. The runaway's lips separated with an expression of gentleness and delight when his beautiful set of ivory teeth seemed to smile through the dusk of evening that was thickening around us. Master, he said, my wife, though black, is as beautiful to me as the president's wife is to him. She is my queen, and I look on our young ones as so many princes, but you shall see them all, for here they are, thank God. There in the heart of the canebrake, I found a regular camp. A small fire was lighted, and on its embers lay griddling some large slices of venison. A lad 9 or 10 years old was blowing the ashes from some fine sweet potatoes. Various articles of household furniture were carefully disposed around, and a large pallet of bear and deer skins seemed to be the resting place of the whole family. The wife raised not her eyes towards mine, and the little ones, 3 in number, retired to a corner, like so many discomfited raccoons. But the runaway, bold and apparently happy, spoke to them in such a cheering words that at once one and all seemed to regard me as one sent by Providence to relieve them from all their troubles. My clothes were hung up by them to dry, and the Negro asked if he might clean and grease my gun, which I permitted him to do, while the wife threw a large piece of deer's flesh to my dog, which the children were already caressing. Only think of my situation, reader. Here I was, 10 miles at least from home, and 4 or 5 from the nearest plantation, in the camp of runaway slaves, and quite at their mercy. My eyes involuntarily followed their motions, but as I thought I perceived in them a strong desire to make me their confidant and friend, I gradually relinquished all suspicions. The venison and potatoes looked quite tempting, and by this time I was in a condition to relish much less savory fare. So, on being humbly asked to divide the viands before us, I partook of as hearty a meal as I had ever done in my life. Supper over, the fire was completely extinguished, and a small lighted pine knot placed in a hollow calabash. Seeing that both the husband and the wife were desirous of communicating something to me, I at once and fearlessly desired them to unburden their minds, when the runaway told me a tale of which the following is the substance. About 18 months before, a planter residing not very far off, having met with some losses, was obliged to expose his slaves at a public sale. The value of his negroes was well known, and on the appointed day, the auctioneer laid them out in small lots or offered them singly in the manner which he judged most advantageous to their owner. The runaway, who was well known as being the most valuable next to his wife, was put up by himself for sale and brought an immoderate price. For his wife, who came next, all alone, $800 were bidden and paid down. Then the children were exposed and, on account of their breed, brought high prices. The rest of the slaves went off at rates corresponding to their qualifications. The runaway chanced to be bought by the overseer of the plantation. The wife was bought by an individual residing about 100 miles off, and the children went to different places along the river. The heart of the husband and father failed him under this dire calamity. For a while he pined in sorrow under his new master, but having marked down in his memory the names of the different persons who had purchased each dear portion of his family, he feigned illness, if indeed he whose affections had been so grievously blasted could be said to feign it, refrained from food for several days, and was little regarded by the overseer, who felt himself disappointed in what he had considered a bargain. On a stormy night, when the elements raged with all the fury of a hurricane, the poor Negro made his escape, and being well acquainted with the neighboring swamps, at once made directly for the canebrake, in the center of which I found his camp. A few nights afterwards, he gained the abode of his wife, and the very next after their meeting, he led her away. The children, one after another, he succeeded in stealing, until at least the whole of the objects of his love were under his care. To provide for 5 individuals was no easy task in those wilds, which, after the first notice was given of the wonderful disappearance of this extraordinary family, were daily ransacked by armed planters. Necessity, it is said, will bring the wolf from the forest. The runaway seems to have well understood the maxim, for under the cover of night he approached his first master's plantation, where he had ever been treated with the greatest kindness. The house servants knew him too well not to aid him to the best of their power, and at the approach of each morning, he returned to his camp with an ample supply of provisions. One day, while in search of wild fruits, he found a bear dead before the muzzle of a gun that had been set for the purpose. Both articles he carried to his home. His friends at the plantation managed to supply him with some ammunition, and on damp and cloudy days, he first ventured to hunt around his camp. Possessed of courage and activity, he gradually became more careless and rambled. Farther in search of game, and rambled farther in search of game. It was on one of his excursions that I met him, and he assured me the noise which I made in passing the bayou had caused him to lose the chance of killing a fine deer, although, he said, my old musket misses fire sadly too often. The runaways, after disclosing their secret to me, both rose from their seat with eyes full of tears. Good master, for God's sake, do something for us and our children. They sobbed forth with one accord. Their little ones lay sound asleep in the fearlessness of their innocence. Who could have heard such a tale without emotion? I promised them my most cordial assistance. They both sat up that night to watch my repose, and I slept close to their urchins, as if on a bed of the softest down. Day broke so fair, so pure, and so gladdening that I told them such heavenly appearances were ominous of good, and that I scarcely doubted of obtaining their full pardon. I desired them to take their children with them and promised to accompany them to the plantation of their first master. They gladly obeyed. My ibises were hung around the camp, and as a memento of my having been there, I notched several trees after which I bade adieu, perhaps for the last time, to that canebrake. We soon reached the plantation, the owner of which, with whom I was well acquainted, received me with all the generous kindness of a Louisiana planter. Ere an hour had passed, the runaway and his family were looked upon as his own. He afterwards repurchased them from their owners and treated them with his former kindness, so that they were rendered as happy as slaves generally are in that country, and continued to cherish that attachment to each other which had led to their adventures. Since this event happened, it has, I have been informed, become illegal to separate slave families without their consent. So that was from volume 2 of his journals. When I was first making the work for the exhibition, I was only aware of volume 1. And in volume 1, when I used the search function to assess how many times he mentions Negroes in the volume, there are only 6 mentions. And so initially I made the work's 6 videos titled 6 Mentions of Negroes in Audubon and his journal. But then I discovered this second volume, and there are 35 mentions of Negroes in that one. All of the mentions in the first volume paints a pretty simple picture of who he is. He's just mentioned selling them, trading them, and ordering them to do different kinds of work. Of all the 35 mentions in volume 2, there are a number of them that feel like more complex interactions, like that one. And I mean, there's so much that happens there. We could probably talk about it for days. But yeah, in the spirit of adding more truth to the situation, layering information on top of information to get a fuller picture of what the world was that they operated in, that he operated in. I want to read that for you. And maybe we could pause there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rodell. Thank you for talking us through the work leading up to the exhibition. Thank you for this amazing exhibition. And that's a lot to read through that Audubon text and follow it up with some questions. But maybe we could start with some questions related to Audubon's relationship to race and the ways in which that's foregrounded. You showed beautifully some of your previous projects, and indeed that was one of the motivating interests when I found your incredible work online and thought this is an artist that I would love to work with. There was such a clear potential for engaging with archival material like the Audubon, but the other connection that felt like a potential spark was your shared history with Audubon's as an artist born in the Caribbean, and that Audubon was born in Haiti, and that also provided a kind of starting point to think about your work in conversation with Audubon's work. So I'm wondering if maybe you could start there and how that complicated part of Audubon's history led through your thinking about Audubon's relationship to race, to Afro-Caribbean people, to indigenous people.
Yes. So, you know, when you initially reached out to invite me to collaborate, I thought of the works that I had done before using archival images of birds. And so I thought in terms of form that I had a sense of where I could start. I am very close with an art historian who is focused on Black studies and Caribbean studies, who asked me, when I told her about this opportunity, she said, oh, and a French-American artist was born in the Caribbean, operating in the 1800s. What was happening in the world? What was happening around him at that time? What was happening with the indigenous people around him? What was happening with the African Americans around him? And that's what prompted me to read his journals, to get a sense of what his interactions with the African Americans in the world he existed in, what those interactions were. And they're very clearly described in his journals. He'll very casually talk about selling the works. I had taken titles of the works from many of the sentences from the journal. So when I first thought there were only 6 mentions, I grabbed texts from those 6 mentions as titles for those 6 works. And I can share some of those with you.
Sounds great.
Um, so these are not the final 7 works that I made, but when I first thought there were 6 works, here is what they were called. The Negro Insurrection, and the full sentence from that one is, my mother, soon after birth, accompanied my father to the estate of Ocae on the island of Santo Domingo, and she was one of the victims of the ever-to-be-lamented period of the Negro Insurrection of that island. Another one was called Purchased a Young Negro from Me, which is an excerpt from this sentence. When our boats arrived at Henderson, he landed with me, purchased many horses, hired some men, and coaxed others to accompany him, purchased a young Negro from me, presented me with a splendid Spanish dagger and my wife with a ring, and went overland towards Natchez with a view of gathering recruits there. The third one is Two Negroes of Mine, and that is an excerpt from, I traveled down to New Orleans in an open skiff, accompanied by 2 Negroes of mine. I reached New Orleans a day too late. Mr. B had been compelled to surrender the steamer to a prior claimant. So that's 3 of them, and these are just like really casual mentions of like basically trading these people. And so that painted a pretty simple picture for me of what I thought the interactions he had with them were. But then the more complex anecdotes were found throughout volume 2, which kind of complicated my picture of what was actually happening at the time. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into making those works.
Could you talk a little bit about, and we see the image here of what happened for you when the text combined with the image? How I experienced those objects almost in a shocking way, where the text surprises you with this incredibly racist language that's foregrounded over an image that we don't necessarily interpret as racist, but maybe changes the way we see the image. What was your experience once you started testing that and combining those 2 things together?
Yeah, I felt a similar kind of surprise. It kind of forces you to understand that, because when all you know is the images and the beauty of the images and the skill that produced them, all you think about, it seems as though those things are produced, can only be produced by somebody who is, I don't know, I guess similar in virtue to me, similarly holds similar virtues to us. But the text says otherwise. It shows us that this person's values are different, and the things that they value are different, or they value things in different ways than we do. And so it is quite jarring to put those 2 things together, which made the work challenging. I had never made anything before that was so sort of, I don't know, possibly unpleasant. I tried to render the text in a way that was inviting, or that seemed to match the sort of, I don't know, sort of jovial character of the birds. But there was that juxtaposition of the meaning of the words. And I just kind of leaned into whatever that sort of collage of realizations or emotions was.
Mm. Could you talk a little bit more about how you approach the idea of creating imaginary histories or new histories, or rewriting our own imagination of history, and how maybe this Audubon work connects to that part of your practice?
Yeah. So the problem is that what's recorded of history is really limited. What's recorded of the history of Black people in the 1800s and the early 1900s is so limited that we basically don't know what their lives were like. And the little that we do know isn't flattering, because the bias with which they were recorded generally is quite unflattering. Which is why images that escape an oppressive framing, or images that go against what has become familiar for us, in what we imagine when we think about what we know about what's depicted about those people, they become quite valuable, those exceptions. So I think of that type of exception when I think about pictures that I find in archives that defy those stereotypes, pictures that are not framed oppressively, pictures of intimacy or playfulness. And I didn't think that those kinds of exceptions existed in Audubon's texts, because after reading the first volume, I felt that they were mostly or even completely unflattering images. But so I was surprised to find what I considered to be exceptions, even though they were complicated, maybe even problematic complications, problematic exceptions in volume 2. But still, there was in his writing words, stories that expanded what I was able to imagine about the Black people that he interacted with. And in the same way that I find other exceptions valuable, I found those valuable, and I wanted to bring all of that into the conversation.
That's great. All right, we're going to pass the microphone around in a second, so be thinking of questions. Maybe one last question for me before I turn it over. What happens when you take a static object and animate it so the object starts to move? And I know we've been talking earlier today with some groups. It can be so challenging for a visual artist to articulate that in words, because what you're doing is creating the image. But could you try for us to think of what happens for you once those images start to move? What kind of potential or power is released in that process?
Well, so because before this project, what I was interested in with other types of images that I would put on the lenses, I was particularly interested in images that depict intimacy because of the way that they can work against sort of stereotypical historic representations. I had kind of formed a habit or an interest in depicting intimacy and in finding intimacy. And so like an image that didn't seem to depict or have any sort of richness in terms of intimacy felt dry to me or not so compelling. So when I was working with these images of the birds that Audubon painted, I felt a similar desire for some kind of interaction from them with another, or some kind of depiction of intimacy or some kind of richness of feeling from them. And I found that when I made the lenses in such a shape that they caused the reflections of the birds to mirror each other at the edges of the lenses, meaning that the bird seems to kiss itself or feed itself or touch itself as the lens spun. I felt like there was something there that was valuable, that brought richness to the image, and some kind of tenderness that I felt added to the layering of like references or feelings that was happening in the creation of the image. I also had really sort of instructive conversations today with two groups of students. There were two questions that were really valuable in helping me to articulate for myself, in an attempt to articulate for them, why I chose these particular images of birds. So the first question was from Brooke, who asked, how come, or she noticed that the birds often looked like they were falling through the sky, which caused me to realize that I had chosen birds that were in flight, as opposed to birds that were resting. And I had just done this from feeling. I'm just trying to get birds that when I put them under the lenses, they look animated in interesting ways. But it turns out that the ones that are in flight, their limbs are spread in such a way that they can be animated by the undulation of lens. And then Ben, who left a little while ago, he asked, out of all the images in which so many of the birds are resting on trees or branches, you notice that I picked ones out in which they were not resting on trees and branches. And so I learned that I had also chosen pictures of birds that had no background. They were free. Their bodies were free to be animated and not be impaired by the images of the branches that they were resting on. So yeah, all of that I think contributed to the images, which, you know, some of the pictures of the birds are not that emotive. You know, they might depict the plumage, or they might show the bird in motion, but I feel like there's a certain richness that comes from seeing the birds sort of touching beaks with reflections of themselves, and it changes the changes what it looks like is happening in the picture.
That's great. All right, let's put some hands up. Who has a question for Rodell? There we go. Hold on, Brooke's going to come around with the microphone. It's much better if you use the microphone, because then we can hear.
I was wondering, so you talked about how you wanted to bring out intimacy in the images, otherwise that aren't there, by doing like the warping, I guess, the lens. So I saw your images of your family and your friends, and I was wondering why you chose those digital elements to add on to, like, what's your process and how you find what you want to add to those, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your question. So before I started using text-to-image AI tools to generate images that depict intimacy, before those tools existed, I felt that I had images that from the actual archive, all the ones that are lacking intimacy, all the ones that of those people laboring, that I wanted to change those images. I wanted to affect what was being depicted in those images. I wanted to change the narrative of those images. And one of the ways I did that, I have a project called Augmented Archive, in which I take those archival images and I add digital objects to them that change the focus of the pictures. Sometimes I put them in the view of what looks like the gaze of the person. So it looks like those people are paying attention to these mysterious objects. And it to the viewer, it appears that this person is having a personal experience of some kind of mysterious nature, which changes the context from one in which they're laboring to one in which they're thinking. And we think about their interiority, we think about their personhood and the complexity of their minds, which I feel broadens the ways that we are able to think about them. And so because I had that process when I was working on these pictures with my family and friends, I brought that process into these pictures. And even though these pictures, the intention was not to reframe an oppressively framed image, they had the effect of kind of adorning those people or like crowning them. And so often in conversations about those pictures, people talk about the crown chakra and talk about sort of, a lot of people talk about like sort of illustrations of souls, or they talk about halos, or they talk about like sort of depictions of spirituality. And yeah, that all kind of goes in line with what, like my feeling and kind of what I was trying to do with those images, which is kind of just celebrate those people. Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
Who else? Brooke's going to come around. Thank you for waiting.
So this is one that Ben had a question about before he had to let you go. He was wondering about the noise that played in the background as you're showing some of these images, and how that contributes to the overall work, and if those are these noises like specifically related to the birds that are depicted in the pictures, or are they like in general like kind of bird noises? So
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, you know, again, with the intention of like sort of depicting intimacy, those are the bird sounds of those birds. So those illustrations by Audubon, they're all titled with the species that's illustrated. And so I was able to find recordings of the sounds of those birds, but none of the recordings are of individual birds. They're always of like sort of colonies of these birds, or them talking to each other or communicating. And so even though we see in many of the images only one bird, there is the chatter of a group of birds, which gives I think, a sense of like community, or like just, yeah, intimacy. Thanks for that question.
That's great. Who else? We have time for one last question, if anybody. Oh, all right. Got a couple.
So oftentimes today we're told to separate the art from the artist when there is a controversial artist. And for example, in the bird world right now, we're renaming a couple hundred different bird species because of the history of who they were named after. And similar with the issue of Audubon, how do you go about like appreciating that art, but then understanding the history of the artist? It's just very complicated to me with the terms of like cancel culture and stuff like that. Now, like, how do you go about appreciating the artist, but then also being aware of the history of that person? How does that affect you in this project?
Yeah, thanks for that question. What I feel like I'm understanding from the text is that I am probably too far removed from that situation to even be able to judge it with any within context. And so I guess the answer is also I don't know. But I'm also recognizing that my perspective seems limited, and so I'm questioning even my own ability to make a judgment. And so I'm leaving room for the possibility that there's more going on than I understand, or that there can be more complex responses, or that there's a way that all of that worked together, even though it could be problematic. Yeah, I don't know. Thanks.
Great question. Maddie, did you have a question? Similar question. Well, I think that's one of the things that's really beautiful for us in this series is the invitation, the opportunity, the testing of different ways of talking about and thinking about Audubon's history, and your work does that so beautifully. So thank you again for being here.
Yeah,
thank you for
Chris.
working with us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks
for
everybody.
coming.
Have a great night.